a lot of times, like you'll see a study come out and then someone will cite this and say like, this is what is happening. And then you'll see another study come out that says the exact opposite. And somebody else will promote it and be like, no, actually, this is what's happening. Like at that point, what do you do?
Oh, man. One thing that tends to be true is that there's usually less actual conflict within a body of research than you would think just from observing social media. If there's like 8 papers on a particular topic, it's often very easy to find 2 that are leaning in completely opposite directions. And so people who really support idea A will kind of find the study with the biggest effect estimate in favor of the thing they promote. The people in favor of B will find like the largest effect estimate in favor of the thing they promote. And it looks like, hey, there's a ton of conflict in this research. Who knows? Like how could we possibly determine which one of these is best? But then if you dig into like all 8 of the studies, you might find that like, oh, hey, like 6 lean in one direction, 1 kind of has null results, and 1 leans in the opposite direction. So it's like, it probably leans that one direction, you know? So that you see that more often than not. When that's not the case, and it's like there are only 2 sub studies on a particular topic and they say different things, yeah, just wait for more research to get published. Like you should never have too much confidence in a single study, like no matter what. If we lived in a world where you could have like large, long-term representative studies with samples in the hundreds or thousands, and it's like, okay, like that is probably pretty robust and generalizable. But if you're dealing with like 8, 10, 12 subjects per group, just like basic like sampling variability, you know, like you're drawing a relatively small subsample of the broader population. And like if the numbers are small enough, you could just get a very unrepresentative subsample, which means that your results probably aren't particularly generalizable. Or like, you know, it could be like any number of other just characteristics of the studies themselves that are actually driving the findings rather than some sort of like kind of core physiological thing that's like a more robust differentiator. The first study on a particular topic tends to have unrepresentative results.
Yeah, it makes sense because it's also never been reproduced either.
Right, yeah. So a great example of this is with concurrent training and the idea of the interference effect. You know, I'm sure everyone has heard that like if you just lift weights, you'll probably build more muscle, build more strength than if you lift weights and also do a decent bit of cardio at the same time. That idea is called the interference effect, that the cardio you're doing interferes with the adaptations to resistance training. The first study on that topic was by Hickson from 1980. It took untrained people, put them through a pretty tough training routine, like lifting routine, and also like a pretty tough, pretty high volume cardio routine as well. And what you generally saw is the group that was just doing resistance training over the course of the entire study gained more strength. I don't know if that one assessed hypertrophy. I don't remember for sure. I don't think it did. And yeah, the resistance training only group gained considerably more strength than the resistance training and cardio group did. So yeah, people looked at that and said, oh, hey, we're looking at concurrent training. We're going to call this the interference effect. We're going to generalize the results of this one study to say like, hey, if you're doing any cardio at all, like that's going to be really bad news for your gains. But then in the intervening 40 years, there's been a lot more research on the topic. And now what you see is like the interference effect is probably real, but is like a lot more context dependent. So you don't really see it generally very much in studies on untrained lifters. And there also seems to be like a pretty fucking reasonable threshold for how much cardio you can do before it really starts impacting you. Like, you know, you don't need to be worried about going on a 30-minute jog 2 or 3 times a week. But if you're doing like really serious aerobic training in addition to your lifting, like, yeah, like that probably is going to have a negative effect. And there's also a timing component where if you do like a strength workout and then immediately go out for a long run, that's going to affect you way more than if you do a strength workout and then run the next day or like 6 hours later that day. So yeah, it's like all of these little nuances, but what you see in a general sense is even with all of that, the general magnitude of the interference effect is like way, way smaller than what the Hickson study observed. And the Hickson study, I think, has the second largest effect size ever observed. in terms of like the magnitude of the interference effect. I mean, it was the first study on the topic, and it's also kind of an outlier result. There haven't been other studies that have found evidence for an interference effect, but just not an interference effect of nearly the magnitude that Hickson determined. And there's a reason. One is that generally the first study in a body of literature is kind of like a proof of concept study almost. Like a researcher will have an idea that like, hey, I think there is an effect that exists that hasn't been like documented and published before. But you don't want to waste your time. You don't want to waste your research funding. So what you're going to do is you're going to design a study that is like calibrated to detect that effect if the effect exists. Like with the Hickson example, the cardio intervention used in that study was like a pretty intense cardio intervention. And so it found like, yeah, if you do enough cardio, like that's going to reduce your strength gains, you know? But then follow-up studies using much more like reasonable kind of moderate cardio interventions have observed like a much, much smaller effect. So like that, it was kind of a proof of concept study. Like it showed like, hey, if you do a lot of cardio, you're not going to gain as much strength. But you shouldn't generalize that to mean like, if you do any cardio, it's going to really mess with your gains.